everyone, and welcome. My name is Hannah Custis, and I'm a member of the Immanence Myth Journal team. And today I'm excited to be joined by Michelle Tocher. Michelle is an author, she is a storyteller, and she has also served as an artist in residence for several organizations. She is joining us today from Toronto. We have worked with Michelle in the past. In our first issue of Immanence, we featured an interview with her on the power of fairy tales and talked a lot about her work with Wonderlit.com, an online site that she uses to help individuals go through their personal journeys using fairy tales. She is joining us today to speak on a topic that has completely absorbed her recently, and she's drawn me in too. Today we're doing 3 different programs on the topic of spells and fairy tales and in life. And for today, we are starting just with coming under spells and the different ways that we see this in fairy tales. So, Michelle, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Hannah. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So my first question for you today, Michelle, is why spells? What is it about this subject, about this topic, that has drawn you in?
Well, I knew you were going to ask me that question, so I had to think about it a bit because it wasn't the first question I asked myself. But when I thought about it and went walking with it, I remembered something from a long time ago. I was in my 20s, and one day I was getting ready for work, and I was looking at myself in the mirror, and I had just finished putting on my makeup, and I, at that time, drew these like Nefertiti style lines around my eyes, and very exotic. And I was headed off to my advertising job, and I looked at myself in the mirror, and I had this moment of saying, I am not who I appear to be. And it was quite unnerving because I became aware of the fact that I wasn't actually in register with my true self. And I began to wonder, well, if I'm not who I appear to be, then who am I? And how can I bring myself more into accord with who I know I truly am? And that kind of began a whole process of spell-breaking experiences in my life. And those experiences led me out of advertising and into communications, and eventually into storytelling. And when I encountered the fairy tale, I encountered this genre of story that is all about spells. It's the only genre of story really where you find wizards and enchantresses and witches and so on, turning others into forms other than themselves. So I became quite enthralled with the fairy tale. And so that's where my interest in spells, I would say, really originated.
So, since we're so fortunate to have a fairy tale expert with us today, can you tell us more about what is the meaning of a spell specifically in a fairy tale and how characters are put under spells?
Yes. Well, in the fairy tale, words have power. They have way more power than in real life. People who are in positions of authority or are particularly powerful, charming individuals have the power of their words. So if they can put a curse on another individual, they can, by the power of their words, turn another individual into a shape other than their own. So a witch can turn a king into a frog. An enchanter can turn a princess into a dragon, and so on. So they have the power of their words to actually change the shape of another. Or they can also change the destiny, the shape of another person's destiny. So, for example, in the Grimm story, The Briar Rose, which is a Sleeping Beauty story, the 13th wise woman, who's not invited to the feast, comes charging into the hall, and it's a christening feast for the little baby princess, and she curses that child to death at the age of 15. She says, "You'll prick your finger on a spindle and you'll fall down dead." And so she has changed the destiny of this child by the power of her words. And then, interestingly enough, the 12th wise woman, who is lined up to give her gift to the child and hasn't yet given her gift, steps forward, and she can't amend it completely. She can't get rid of the death sentence, but she changes the sentence. She says it will not be death, but a deep sleep into which the princess shall fall. So she is able to influence the child's destiny in her way as well. And we see this in fairy tales a lot. Fairies gather around a pregnant queen or a woman, and they start handing out talents and gifts, and also some pretty difficult things, like he's going to have the head of a pig or things like that. So words in these stories have the power to change one another's forms and destinies.
So how does it work in real life, whatever that is? Are words important there too? How do we find ourselves under spells or in the power of others?
Yeah, so when you think about it in real life, it's not just in the fairy tale, really, where words have power. We're just not conscious of our words as much. We don't realize when we use a label to describe somebody that's a very negative label, how powerful that can be. People in power, especially people who have positions of authority, have the power of words. People who have a lot of conviction about what they believe, who may themselves be under a delusion, but are very certain about their delusion and have a position of power, can cast spells on people. People who are very charming and seductive can lure people in to a particular way of seeing themselves. And really what a spell is it is a way of seeing ourselves. It's a self-concept that we adopt from these powerful individuals who have the power of their words.
What examples can you think of? Can you think of any particular powerful individuals? There are some that are obvious that come to mind for me when we think of political figures or external authorities of that nature, army commanders, principals at a school, but are there some that we might not necessarily think of who can influence us with their words and their power?
Yes, and I should say to begin with that there are dark spells in fairy tales, and there are also good spells. So we'll talk about good spells later. But in terms of, so let's just talk about dark spells, because those spellcasters, they are the ones who put us in these places where we adhere to this idea of ourselves that's not a very good idea. And I'll just to talk a little bit more about these enchanters and where they're coming from. These kinds of curses and these words that they use come from various motivations. I mean, they may come from fear, like, there's a fairy tale called The Crystal Ball in the Grimm's collection, where a sorceress who has 3 sons, starts to fear that her sons are going to take her power away from her. So she turns her sons into animals. She turns her eldest son into an eagle and her next son into a whale. And they leave home, obviously, and they are stuck in these other forms that are not themselves because of the fear that she had that they would take her power. And we see various other kinds of enchanters in fairy tales coming from different motivations. Dark powers, powerful feelings like envy, and or the will to power, the will to have power over another. And so that's where the enchanters are coming from in these stories. They're coming from a motivation, conscious or unconscious, that is a negative and seeks to control the victim, as it were.
So you said that there were negative examples, bad spells, and that the enchanters that cast them may or may not be aware of what they're doing. I'm thinking a little bit of my role in the past. I've been a teacher for children, and how to be very aware of the different ways that I could influence them and how I could influence their self-concept, or ways that the children were influencing each other, self-concept, their peer relationships.
Yes, absolutely. And this is kind of the other side of it. So we've talked about the enchanters, and then there is the ones who come under the spell. And why do we come under spells? What is it about us that makes it possible for us to come under a spell? And the sort of classic examples are when we're young and impressionable. And as you say, when we're dealing with teachers and parents have a great deal of power over the self-concept of the children. And so I remember interviewing a woman who was the daughter of a mother who was an alcoholic, and her mother said to her over and over again, "You're just useless." And she grew up with this self-concept that she had no worth, and then played that out in her life because this deep conviction had been seeded in her from way back when. And her life just seemed to be more and more of an accumulation of evidence for that. I have a personal story actually about how I was influenced by a teacher on my very first day of school. I was in my first classroom, and the teacher handed out these little scribblers and gave us all a package of little crayons. And I was so excited because we were going to learn how to write. We were going to learn how to spell. And so she was talking, and I drew out my favorite color, which is blue, and I drew a blue line down the spine of every page in the book, just to make the book my own. And then all of a sudden I see this dark figure standing beside me, and she takes me up to the front of the class, and she makes me show my scribbler with the blue line to everybody. And then she actually chants a spell to the class. She says, "What do we say about this, class? Shame, shame, double shame." And I was just so humiliated that I learned from then on that my own creative impulses were not going to be acceptable in the classroom situation, and in fact would not only hinder me but humiliate me. And that repeated itself through school all the way to university. I had professors coming to me and saying, "You know, you've got a lot of creativity, Michelle, but hide it away. If you want to get A's, don't show your professors this creativity. Just listen to what they tell you and follow their instructions and play by the rules. So there I was, living by the script. I adhered very deeply to that. And this is what happens to us in life in various ways. When we're impressionable, we get taken in and we believe these ideas. You know, if we're bullied in school and we're called, labeled, you know, these horrible names like, what a wimp, or you're a retard. You know, these things, they go very deeply into us and start to, they can start to dictate how we see ourselves and then our experiences from then on out. So it happens when we're young. And it also happens all the way through life. I mean, our culture is a spellcaster in certain ways. I was looking at some vintage ads for housewives in the 1950s, and I thought, wow, you know, look at this, because the advertisers were basically defining what it meant to be a housewife with these spell casting pictures. And she was learning, women were learning that to be a good housewife, you have to please your husband at all times and be obedient, and, you know, be a house cleaner and a hostess, and all these amazing, you know, difficult things for anybody to be. And that was the role that went with being the acceptable housewife. So that's a spell. And there are many examples when you start thinking about all the various ways in which we can be put under spells, or spells are being casted. You start looking at the media and the world in quite a different way.
It seems almost impossible to avoid being put under a spell in some ways. All the things that can shape our self-concept and the way that we see ourselves, and how we can be lulled into believing something or hooked into believing something. So I'd like to ask, are all spells necessarily bad spells or negative? Are there other options or other examples?
Right. There in fairy tales, we find bad spells and we find good spells. There are good spellcasters. There are, you know, the classic fairy godmother and good witches and good wizards. And they cast good spells for specific purposes. So, for example, with Cinderella, which we all know quite well, that especially that French version, the Charles Perrault's version of Cinderella with the pumpkin and the ball and the glass slipper and all that, and the fairy godmother, who everybody loves because she's a perfect example of a good spellcaster. So here's Cinderella. She's actually living in quite a negative self-concept. She thinks she doesn't have any more purpose than just to be a fairly invisible servant of the household. And the fairy godmother comes along and she gives her the means by casting a spell on her that allows her to go to the ball. So for a limited time only, because come midnight, it's all going to go back to the way it was before, she has an opportunity to see her possibilities and then come back and review where she's at in her life. So that's a good example of how a good spell is cast, which, you know, translates to life in various ways. If there was something that was really out of your comfort zone, like you were sure that you could never dance, you know, you're very, very rigid and you couldn't sort of move like that. And then a friend says, well, you know, you've always wanted to try this. Why don't you go to this dance class? And you spend an evening just trying something entirely new and then coming back gives you an opportunity to review. So that's one way. And the other ways, there's a lot of different ways. If you're looking at fairy tales, you can kind of find all sorts of different examples of this. But the other example would be where a good person casts a spell on somebody who needs to hide for a period of time or retreat. Like in the fairy tale of the goose girl at the well, she leaves the castle and goes up the mountain and comes into the service of a goose woman, an old woman, who casts a spell over her so that she wears the identity of her daughter, an older girl who doesn't have her beauty. And every night she goes to the well and she peels off the mask and she washes it in the water, lets it dry in the grass, and then puts it on the next day. For the duration of the time that she is away from the kingdom, she is disguised so that she can heal and she can get perspective and so on. And the one last example would be when a good spell is cast on people who are in flight. Like I'm thinking of the Nixie at the mill pond. The lovers are running to escape the flood that's coming after them, this water that's going to inundate them. And a good old woman turns them into frogs so that they can swim and survive this flood. And then when the flood is over, they resume their human shapes and are able to go on with their lives. So the good spells facilitate us when we need to change our shape, change our identity for a period of time, but underlying it is the knowledge of who we actually are, and in most cases the voluntary ability to take the mask off.
So the good spell can be for protection or to serve us, but cast by someone who wants to help us or aid us. And I'm picking up on what you said, and it's temporary. It's to serve a purpose, and it sounds like you're saying the characters know that they're under a spell or that this is something being done to help them. Mm-hmm. So tell me more about this idea of a deep spell, where maybe you've been enchanted and you don't know, and it's not in order to help you. Or maybe it is. I don't know. Tell us more about this deep spell.
It sometimes gets kind of, you don't always know, like it's kind of in between. Just before we go to deep spells, there's an example of that in Beauty and the Beast, because the envious sisters are at the end of Beaumont's version of the story. The fairy comes along, and these two girls are standing in front of the palace where Beauty is coming and going with the Beast. They both transformed, and they're having their lovely lives, and their envious sisters are not happy about it at all. And the fairy turns them both into statues who have to stand at the door and watch Beauty come and go. And she says, you'll retain your reason, so you will be able to think, and you might be able to change out of these statues, but the conversion of a malicious and envious mind is something of a miracle. So it isn't going to be easy. So is it a good spell? Is it a bad spell? It's kind of on the fence there. There are spells that are brought upon characters in order to teach them something. And I've always thought that was just really an interesting thought. How do they get out of that spell? How do they get out of that spell? How would they convert their envy to something that is more compassionate? So, yes. So deep spells. Yes. Well, deep spells are, I think one mark of a deep spell and a dark spell is that the character is not able to get out of this conviction. You're stuck. it's a trap. It's a place that you are convinced defines who you are. And even though it's harmful and it hurts, you don't seem to think that it's possible to change the way you look at it. So if you have a deep conviction that you are going to always suffer in your life and that things always happen to you and you're always meant to suffer, that's been implanted really deeply. Even the moments of your life when you're not suffering, you're not really ascribing any weight or validity to that. The only thing that you're ascribing validity and weight to are the experiences of suffering that you have. And that's a deep spell. And you see them expressed in the fairy tales in all sorts of different ways. So I would say one of the markings of being in a deep spell in a fairy tale is that the character isn't aware that he or she is under a spell. And when I look at the frog and the Frog King, I think of him as that kind of character. The way I see him is this frog who has forgotten that he is actually a king, and he completely adheres to his frog form. He has no remembrance of his kingly nature. And so he would be under a very deep spell, because if you've forgotten, if you don't know that you're under a spell, how on earth are you going to get out of that spell? And another one might be an example of Snow White. Snow White was put under a very deep spell, and she's paralyzed. She's presumably unconscious and not aware of being in that state. So those would be the deepest, I would say.
So other than that, a character can't remember their previous form. And you use this word adherence, that they're stuck in a shape or that they're stuck in a conception of themselves. The frog who doesn't remember being human, or Snow White. You're speaking of when you might have to help me with the story here. At the end of the story, when she becomes poisoned and she's paralyzed. So, and I'm relying on the Disney version, I'll admit it.
That's okay. Basically the same pattern.
So what keeps a character in that state of adherence? What keeps them under that deep spell?
Yes, it's a really good question. And I think they're actually probably the very, very deepest spell is where there is what Joseph Campbell called refusal present, where there might be a glimpse of the possibility that you can get out of that spell, but you will not, you cannot. And I think I have a great feeling of compassion for the various instances of that. Sometimes that's because the spell is so dark. Like in the case of Snow White, she is spelled down into that deep place of paralysis because of the powerful envy of her stepmother. And the problem for her is that she can't emerge, because if she emerges, she is going to be put to death. And that tells us something about envy, doesn't it? The power of that curse. So she can't come to life. In other instances, I would say it's kind of necessity. You know, when you look at the Briar Rose, the Sleeping Beauty story, she has been put to sleep for a term of 100 years, and she can't wake up until the spell is over and complete. And I remember actually understanding that, getting some insight into that when I did a workshop on the Briar Rose, and one of the participants was experiencing that spell, and she was struggling with the fact that in her own life she couldn't break out of the grief that she was experiencing as a result of some terrible things that had happened in her family. And it gave her a sense of relief when she realized that the term of grief is a wild thing, and it's not something that she could control and willfully break out of. So it enabled her to change her response to the grief, just in terms of recognizing what it was. And then, of course, there are the instances where refusal to come out of a spell is willful. And this is a very dark place, but it's a character who says, I'm not going to change because it doesn't serve me to change. And in the fairy tales, we see this in figures of the king often, the vain king who has everybody under control. Why would he want to change? He doesn't want to become vulnerable. He doesn't want to lose any of his power. He doesn't want to admit any of his weaknesses or fears. And a great example of that is a story called Prince Darling, which was written by one of the women in France during the 1600s. And Prince Darling is this king who has everybody doing exactly what he wants. He's got everything under control. And if he wants something, he gets it. So he has no reason to change at all. And he gets nastier and nastier. He starts making people examples of things so that he can ensure his control, and he's advised by these very evil folks. And finally, actually, in this story, it's kind of interesting because the fairy Truth appears to him, and she says to him, I'm going to turn you into the shape of who you actually are. You are going to appear the way you are, and the way you are is a monster. And so Prince Darling's shape, it's a whole reversal, assumes the shape of a monster, which is exactly who he is, and off to the woods he goes. So yes, in these very deep places, we see that there isn't always the possibility for self-realization, because there is some element of refusal there.
I'm thinking back to your example earlier of feeling that you were uncreative and being shamed by that, and other scenarios that people likely have of where they're told something about themselves, and they're perhaps enchanted and lured into believing that, but there's probably also a part of them that is getting some kind of reward or pleasure from believing that, and choose in a state of refusal to become conscious of it. I'm just thinking about the different levels of what you're speaking of. And I wanted to point us in the direction of hope, maybe, or this becoming aware, insofar as what can fairy tales tell us about breaking these spells or becoming conscious of the different ways that we're enchanted and believe things about ourselves?
Well, yes, and there is hope, and thank goodness for fairy tales, I would say. Walter Benjamin, in his essay, The Storyteller, he wrote something really beautiful. He said the fairy tale is our best counsel because it helps us to lift the weight that the nightmare of the old myths have placed on our chests. And these stories are helpful in that they don't keep the character locked in to the spell. They show us a process. The character goes through a process, and it comes out the other end. So that there is some kind of purposefully redemptive and hopeful ending, and we can begin to see the pattern of our own stories as we go into it, which we will do. But at this stage, I would just say, the wonderful thing is that the fairy tale enables us to kind of do a soul diagnosis, a self-diagnosis. It allows us to look inside, because we don't necessarily know that we're in these states of deep conviction. They're deep underneath there. They're like, the little troll under the earth who's got us dancing to his tune, and we don't know he's under there. So they help us to identify the states that we're in, whether we've been lured or intimidated or envied or trapped in all these various ways. And so we'll be talking about that as we go along, how the process works.
Thank you, Michelle. And as Michelle noted, our second program in this series will be going along with that process. Program 2 will be on the topic of waking up from spells, which we look forward to hearing more about. And Michelle, is there anything that you would like to leave us with, or that you would like to say before we close?
No, not really. I'm really looking forward to our second conversation. I very much am, as we start to look at waking up from a spell and experiencing what that's like. Thank you very much, Hannah.
You are very welcome. And thank you to our viewers, and we hope you join us for the second conversation in this series on spells and fairy tales in real life. Thank you again.